What if everything you were taught about the discovery of America was only half the truth? What if America was never discovered at all, but taken, renamed, and rewritten? Before ships crossed the Atlantic, before flags were planted in the soil, millions of people already lived, loved, governed, and believed on this land. Their story was not erased by accident, but by power. Tonight, we're not repeating the textbook version. We're pulling history apart, piece by piece, to ask one dangerous question: who really discovered America, and why does the answer still matter today? Don't blink, because once you see this story clearly, you'll never see America the same way again. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. Who discovered America? A history speech. History often begins with a name, a date, a declaration, but the truth, real truth, rarely arrives so neatly. For centuries, textbooks have answered a single question with confidence: America was discovered in 1492. A simple sentence: comfortable, incomplete. Because America was not discovered the way one discovers an empty room. It was already alive, long before wooden ships cut across the Atlantic, long before maps tried to tame the unknown. This land breathed with civilization. Forests echoed with voices. Rivers carried stories. Cities rose not of stone alone, but of belief, memory, and belonging. Millions lived here, farmed, traded, governed, prayed, loved, and died without knowing they were waiting to be discovered. And yet the question persists: who discovered America? To answer it honestly, we must slow down. We must listen. The first Americans, the earliest discoverers of America, left no written proclamation. They crossed not oceans, but ice, not seeking conquest, but survival. Tens of thousands of years ago, small groups followed animals across a frozen land bridge from Asia into what we now call North America. They did not arrive with flags or claims. They arrived with families, with hunger, with hope. Over generations, they spread across the continent. They became nations, diverse, sophisticated, resilient. From the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley to the city planners of the Southwest, from the fishing cultures of the Pacific Northwest to the agricultural societies of the East, these people shaped the land and were shaped by it. They named the rivers. They understood the seasons. They belonged. If discovery means being first, then they discovered America, the world beyond the horizon. But history is also shaped by encounters, by moments when worlds collide. In the late 15th century, Europe was restless. Kingdoms competed, faith mixed with ambition. Gold and glory whispered promises to those willing to risk the unknown. Across the Atlantic sailed men who believed the world could be measured, claimed, and converted. In 1492, a fleet reached islands in the Caribbean. The voyage would change history, not because land was found, but because power arrived. The men who stepped ashore believed they had reached the edge of Asia. They believed they were explorers. They believed history had chosen them. But from the perspective of those already living there, this was not discovery. It was interruption, discovery or definition. So what does it mean to discover a place that already exists? For Europe, discovery meant entry into their maps, their markets, their imagination. It meant America became known to them, and therefore, in their minds, owned. For the indigenous peoples, it meant disease before dialogue, conquest before understanding, and loss before recognition. Discovery, in this sense, was not a moment of wonder. It was a turning point of consequence. The myth we inherited, the story of discovery, became a story of simplicity. A single hero, a single year, a single truth. But history resists simplicity. America was not discovered once. It was encountered again and again by different people in different ways for different reasons. Vikings reached its shores centuries earlier. Native nations knew its every corner long before that. European empires fought to define it. Enslaved Africans were forced into it. Immigrants dreamed their way into it. Each arrival reshaped what America meant. The deeper truth, the real question, is not who discovered America, but who gets to define it. Is it the one who arrived first, the one who claimed it, the one who survived it, or the one still struggling to make it live up to its promise? America is not a discovery frozen in the past. It is a story still being written, a story of contradiction and courage, of injustice and reinvention, of people who arrive, people who resist, and people who refuse to disappear. Conclusion. So when we ask who discovered America, the honest answer is uncomfortable and therefore necessary. America was not discovered by one man. It was revealed by many, claimed by some, built by others, and carried forward by generations still searching for what it truly means. History does not ask us for easy answers. It asks us for humility, because the past is not just something we inherit. It is something we are responsible for understanding. And America, from the very beginning, has been more than a place. It has been a question long before any European sail appeared on the horizon, long before foreign languages tried to rename rivers and mountains. America already existed as a living, breathing world. This land was not silent or empty. It was filled with movement, memory, and meaning. The idea that a continent could wait patiently to be discovered misunderstands both history and humanity. America was not a blank page. It was a library of civilizations, each with its own knowledge, traditions, and sense of belonging, written over thousands of years. The first people did not arrive in a moment of conquest or ceremony. They came slowly, across generations, following animals, seasons, and survival itself. They crossed a frozen bridge of land during an age when ice ruled the northern world, unaware that their footsteps would one day be debated by historians. They did not see themselves as founders of a continent. They were parents, hunters, storytellers, and builders, adapting to new landscapes and making them home. Over time, these early communities spread in every direction, learning the rhythms of forests, plains, deserts, and coastlines, shaping cultures as varied as the land itself. As centuries passed, these peoples became nations. Not tribes in the simplistic sense later imposed on them, but complex societies with systems of governance, diplomacy, trade, and law. Some built vast cities aligned with the stars, where religion, science, and daily life were deeply connected. Others organized confederations that balanced power through consensus rather than force. Agriculture flourished long before European plows touched the soil, with crops engineered over generations to feed growing populations. Corn, beans, and squash were not accidents of nature, but the result of deep understanding of ecology and patience across time. Language filled the continent. Thousands of distinct tongues carried songs, prayers, and histories. Knowledge passed not through books, but through memory, ritual, and oral tradition. Elders held the past, children carried the future, and stories stitched generations together. Time was not measured by calendars, but by seasons, migrations, and ceremonies. Eland itself was a teacher, offering instruction through weather, animal behavior, and cycles of growth and rest. Spiritual life was inseparable from daily existence. Mountains were not obstacles, but ancestors. Rivers were not resources, but relatives. The earth was not something to be owned, but something to which one belonged. This worldview shaped how communities lived, hunted, farmed, and governed themselves. Balance mattered more than accumulation. Survival depended on respect, restraint, and reciprocity. Long before modern environmental language existed, these societies practiced sustainability because their future depended on it. Trade networks stretched across thousands of miles, connecting distant peoples through exchange of goods, ideas, and beliefs. Obsidian, shells, copper, and textiles traveled far from their origins. Along with them traveled stories, technologies, and alliances. These networks proved that America was not isolated or primitive, but interconnected and dynamic. Conflicts existed, as they do in all human societies, but so did diplomacy, treaties, and negotiated peace. Women often held positions of influence, authority, and respect, especially in agricultural and political life. In many nations, lineage passed through mothers, and women chose leaders or removed them when they failed their people. This balance of power challenges later assumptions imposed by outsiders who misunderstood or deliberately ignored social structures that did not mirror their own. By the time Europeans began looking westward across the Atlantic, America was already ancient. Generations had lived and died here. Civilizations had risen, transformed, and in some cases fallen, leaving behind roads, mounds, canals, and cities that still puzzle archaeologists. These were not the works of wandering bands, but of organized societies capable of large-scale planning and cooperation. The land bore the fingerprints of human presence everywhere, from managed forests to cultivated wetlands. The idea of wilderness, later celebrated by newcomers, was often the result of careful stewardship rather than untouched nature. Forests were burned deliberately to encourage growth. Rivers were managed to support fishing. Fields were rotated to protect soil. What appeared to outsiders as untouched land was often a carefully balanced environment shaped by human intelligence and restraint. When European explorers eventually arrived, they did not step into emptiness. They encountered people who fed them, guided them, traded with them, and in many cases saved them from starvation. Without indigenous knowledge of crops, seasons, and terrain, many early expeditions would not have survived. The very success of later settlements depended on knowledge that already existed here, learned through contact and often taken without acknowledgement. Yet the presence of these civilizations did not fit the story Europe wanted to tell itself. Admitting that America already existed as a developed world would have complicated claims of ownership and divine purpose, so the land was described as new, empty, or underused. Its people were labeled as obstacles rather than nations. Language became a tool of erasure, turning living societies into footnotes or myths. This rewriting of reality allowed conquest to be framed as discovery and domination to be framed as destiny. It transformed a meeting of worlds into a one-sided narrative where existence only began when Europe arrived. But history does not change simply because it is ignored. Beneath the rewritten maps and renamed places, the truth remained embedded in the land and carried in memory. America existed long before European arrival, not only as geography, but as civilization. It existed in governance systems that valued consensus, in economies that balanced use and preservation, in cultures that understood time as cyclical rather than linear. It existed in the knowledge of healing plants and astronomical observations, in architectural achievements aligned with solstices and equinoxes. It existed in songs sung for centuries and in burial grounds holding generations of ancestors. To say America existed before Europe arrived is not to deny later history, but to restore depth to it. It is to recognize that the continent did not begin in 1492 and that its story cannot be told honestly without acknowledging the lives already rooted here. These people were not waiting to be discovered. They were living full human lives, unaware that their existence would one day be questioned, minimized, or denied, unaware that their homeland would be redefined by others who could not imagine a world that did not begin with themselves. To understand the idea that indigenous civilizations were the first discoverers, the meaning of discovery itself must be reconsidered. Discovery is often framed as a dramatic moment, a single arrival marked by documentation and declaration. But human discovery does not begin with ink on paper or a flag planted in soil. It begins with movement, survival, and recognition. The first people who encountered this land did not stumble upon it briefly and move on. They entered it, learned it, and stayed. Through this enduring relationship, they discovered America in the most complete sense possible. The earliest indigenous peoples arrived without knowing they were crossing into what future generations would call a new continent. They followed familiar instincts across unfamiliar terrain, guided by animals, weather, and necessity. Their discovery was gradual, unfolding over lifetimes. Each valley explored, each river crossed, each coast reached, added to a growing understanding of the land. Discovery was not a single event, but a continuous process of learning and adaptation. Over time, this knowledge became collective, Shar. Across generations through memory, practice, and story. To discover a place is to know its dangers and its gifts. Indigenous peoples learned which plants healed and which harmed, which seasons brought abundance and which demanded caution. They mapped the land not with ink, but with experience. Trails became roads, camps became villages, villages became cities. Their discovery included not only geography, but ecology, astronomy, and climate. They understood migration patterns of animals, cycles of rainfall, and movements of stars. This knowledge was essential to survival and reflects a depth of discovery unmatched by those who arrived briefly and named what they barely understood. Indigenous discovery was intimate. Rivers were not just routes, but sources of life. Mountains were not barriers, but landmarks tied to identity and belief. Coastlines were read like texts, offering signs of weather and food. This form of discovery required patience and presence. It demanded listening rather than conquering. It produced cultures that were responsive to their environments rather than dominant over them. In this way, discovery became a relationship rather than an achievement. As populations grew, indigenous societies expanded and diversified. Different regions produced different forms of life, governance, and belief. In some areas, large urban centers emerged with complex political structures and social organization. In others, smaller, mobile communities thrived by adapting to harsh or changing environments. Each represented a different answer to the same discovery, how to live well in a specific place. These were not random or primitive responses, but thoughtful systems refined over centuries. Trade and communication networks reveal how extensive indigenous discovery truly was. Goods traveled vast distances, connecting forests to deserts, mountains to coastlines. Along with materials came ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. This exchange demonstrates awareness of lands far beyond one's immediate surroundings. It shows that indigenous peoples did not only discover their own regions, but understood the continent as an interconnected whole. Knowledge of distant places existed even without direct travel, shared through networks of trust and alliance. Discovery also includes naming, and indigenous languages named the land with precision and meaning. Names described physical features, historical events, or spiritual significance. These names reflected deep observation and memory. They encoded knowledge into language, ensuring that future generations would understand the land not as an abstraction, but as a lived reality. When later arrivals replaced these names, they erased layers of discovery that had taken centuries to accumulate. Indigenous governance systems further demonstrate the depth of their discovery. Many societies developed methods of decision-making that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. Councils debated issues affecting the community, leaders were chosen for wisdom rather than force, and power was often limited by tradition. These systems emerged from long experience living in specific environments, responding to challenges such as resource management, conflict resolution, and social cohesion. Such political discovery was as significant as any geographic one. The spiritual dimension of indigenous discovery cannot be separated from the physical. Many cultures understood the land as alive, imbued with spirit and purpose. Sacred sites marked places of origin, transformation, or remembrance. Ceremonies aligned with natural cycles reinforced a sense of connection and continuity. Through ritual and belief, indigenous peoples discovered meaning in the landscape, creating moral frameworks that guided behavior and preserved balance. This discovery shaped identity and belonging in ways that extended beyond material survival. When Europeans arrived, they brought a different definition of discovery, one rooted in documentation, ownership, and external recognition. But their arrival did not invalidate what already existed. The fact that indigenous discovery was not recorded in European languages does not diminish its legitimacy. On the contrary, it highlights a different way of knowing, one based on experience rather than proclamation. The land was already known, already understood, already inhabited in complex and meaningful ways. Indigenous peoples did not merely discover America and then vanish into the background of history. Their knowledge continued to shape events long after contact. They guided explorers, taught settlers how to grow crops, and navigated rivers and forests that outsiders could not comprehend alone. Survival of early European colonies often depended on indigenous discovery passed on through cooperation or coercion. Even as this knowledge was used, its source was frequently denied or forgotten. The concept of indigenous discovery challenges the idea that history begins when it is written by outsiders. It asserts that presence matters, that relationship matters, that continuity matters. To discover is to engage fully with a place, to allow it to shape culture and identity over time. By this measure, indigenous civilizations were not only the first discoverers of America, they were its most enduring interpreters. Their discovery was not an act completed and left behind, but a living process carried forward through generations, adapting to change while rooted in deep understanding of the land and its rhythms. The idea that European discovery marked the beginning of America depends on a narrow definition of what discovery means. When Europeans arrive, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they did not encounter a void waiting to be filled with meaning. They encountered people, systems, languages, economies, and spiritual traditions already rooted in the land. What followed was not a beginning, but a meeting. And that meeting was shaped by unequal power, competing worldviews, and radically different understandings of land, ownership, and purpose. To describe this moment as discovery elevates one perspective while silencing another, turning an encounter into a starting point that ignores everything that came before. European explorers carried with them assumptions formed by their own history. In their worldview, land existed to be claimed, named, and ruled. Authority flowed from monarchs. Faith justified expansion, and written records defined reality. When they arrived in the Americas, they interpreted what they saw through this lens. If they did not recognize familiar signs of cities, borders, or property, they assumed absence rather than difference. This misunderstanding allowed them to describe inhabited lands as empty and organized societies, as primitive, transforming encounter into entitlement. The moment Europeans stepped onto American shores, two histories collided. One was linear, driven by progress, accumulation, and conquest. The other was cyclical, rooted in balance, continuity, and relationship. This collision was not neutral. European powers possessed ships, weapons, and diseases that tipped the balance decisively. What might have been mutual exchange became domination. The narrative of discovery helped justify this imbalance by framing European arrival as destiny rather than intrusion. To call European arrival discovery suggests that knowledge only becomes real when acknowledged by Europe. Lands unknown to European maps were treated as unknown altogether. This perspective turned indig, Enos knowledge, into invisibility. Rivers already named for generations were renamed. Borders drawn without consent ignored existing territories. Treaties were signed and broken based on assumptions that indigenous nations lacked legitimacy. Discovery became a legal and moral tool, granting power to those who arrived later while denying it to those who had always been there. Encounter, unlike discovery, implies reciprocity. It recognizes that both sides bring history, culture, and agency. But the European encounter with America rarely allowed for equality. Trade often gave way to exploitation. Missionary work blurred into cultural erasure. Alliances shifted as empires competed for control. The encounter reshaped indigenous societies through violence, displacement, and loss, while European societies were enriched through resources, land, and labor extracted from the New World. Disease was one of the most devastating elements of this encounter. Illnesses carried unknowingly by Europeans swept through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed. Entire communities were lost before meaningful contact even occurred. This biological impact altered demographics and power structures, making conquest easier and resistance more difficult. Yet this tragedy is often detached from the story of discovery, treated as an unfortunate side effect rather than a defining consequence of encounter. European records describe first sightings, first landings, first settlements, but these firsts exist only within European experience. For indigenous peoples, these moments were not beginnings but disruptions. Their histories did not reset when foreign ships arrived. Their calendars did not restart. Their world did not become new. It became unstable. The encounter forced adaptation under pressure, reshaping societies in ways they did not choose. The language of discovery simplifies a complex human moment into a celebratory milestone. It allows later generations to inherit pride without responsibility. Encounter demands more honesty. It requires acknowledgement of conflict, coercion, and consequence. It recognizes that what one side experienced as opportunity, the other experienced as loss. Encounter also explains why the legacy of European arrival remains unresolved, continuing to shape debates over land, sovereignty, and justice. European arrival also depended heavily on indigenous encounter. Explorers survived because they were fed, guided, and taught. Maps were drawn using indigenous knowledge. Crops were cultivated based on indigenous agricultural practices. Routes followed indigenous trails. Without this encounter, European settlement would have faltered. Yet the narrative of discovery often portrays Europeans as self-sufficient pioneers rather than dependent newcomers navigating an unfamiliar world through borrowed knowledge. As European colonies expanded, encounter hardened into structure. Laws were imposed, borders enforced, identities categorized. Indigenous peoples were no longer seen as nations but as obstacles or wards. Encounter became assimilation or removal. The initial meeting of cultures turned into a long process of domination justified by the original claim of discovery. If the land was discovered, then it could be owned. If it could be owned, then those already there could be displaced. Understanding European arrival as encounter rather than discovery shifts responsibility. It challenges inherited myths and opens space for multiple perspectives. It allows history to be seen not as a triumphal march, but as a series of human choices with lasting consequences. It restores agency to indigenous peoples and acknowledges that European actions were neither inevitable nor benign. Encounter reveals contingency, conflict, and moral complex. This reframing does not erase European history in America. It places it in context. Europeans did not create America from nothing. They entered a world already shaped by human hands and minds. Their arrival transformed that world, but transformation is not creation. The land did not begin with them. and its meaning cannot be fully understood through their experience alone. Encounter recognizes that America's story expanded when Europeans arrived, but it did not start there, and the meaning of that moment continues to be negotiated through memory, identity, and unresolved history carried forward into the present through laws, landscapes, and lives shaped by what followed the moment when worlds met under unequal terms and continued to press against each other in ways that still define how America understands itself. The story of discovery has never been only about movement across oceans or the sighting of land. It has always been shaped by power and by the authority to decide whose perspective matters. From the moment Europeans arrived in the Americas, the narrative of discovery was constructed by those who possessed weapons, ships, writing systems recognized by global empires, and the confidence that their version of events would be preserved. Power determined not only what happened on the ground, but how those events would be remembered, recorded, and taught for generations. European empires did not simply explore. They documented. Journals, maps, royal decrees, and church records transformed experience into official history. These records carried weight because they were backed by institutions that enforced their legitimacy. When European explorers wrote that they had discovered new lands, their words became truth in courts, churches, and schools across the world. Indigenous voices, preserved through oral tradition rather than written text, were dismissed as UN, reliable or invisible. Perspective became privilege, and privilege became permanence. Power shaped language itself. Words like discovery, civilization, savage, and wilderness were not neutral descriptions, but tools that framed reality in ways that justified domination. To call a land discovered implied that it had no prior owner worthy of recognition. To label societies as uncivilized suggested they lacked moral or political legitimacy. These terms were repeated until they hardened into assumptions, shaping how entire continents were understood by people who had never seen them. The legal foundations of colonial expansion reveal how deeply power influenced the narrative. European nations developed doctrines that declared land unoccupied if it was not used according to European standards of agriculture or settlement. This definition ignored indigenous relationships to land that emphasized stewardship over ownership. By redefining what counted as legitimate use, European powers transformed perspective into law, granting themselves moral and legal authority to claim territories already inhabited. Religion further reinforced this imbalance. Many Europeans believed they carried a divine mandate to spread their faith and worldview. This belief placed them at the center of history, casting others as obstacles to a higher purpose. When conquest was framed as salvation, resistance could be dismissed as ignorance or evil. Power wrapped itself in righteousness, making the narrative of discovery not just political but moral, perspective-shaped, whose suffering was acknowledged and whose was erased. The devastation caused by disease, warfare, and displacement was often minimized or justified as unavoidable. Indigenous deaths became statistics or footnotes, while European hardship was elevated into heroism. The ability to frame loss determined whose pain mattered. Power ensured that the consequences of discovery were interpreted differently depending on who experienced them. Even maps reflect this imbalance. European cartographers redrew the world with Europe at the center, shrinking other regions or leaving them blank until claimed. Place names honored European monarchs and saints, replacing indigenous names that carried history and meaning. Each renamed river or mountain was an act of narrative control, asserting that history began with European recognition. Perspective was etched into geography, making power visible on the surface of the earth. Education systems inherited these narratives and passed them on as fact. Generations were taught simplified stories of brave explorers in empty lands, rarely questioning whose voices were missing. Power ensured continuity, turning selective memory into national identity. The repetition of these stories made them feel natural, even inevitable, while alternative perspectives were marginalized or dismissed as revisionism. Indigenous resistance to these narratives has always existed, but power determined how widely it was heard. Oral histories preserved truths that contradicted official accounts, but without institutional backing, they struggled to reach broader audiences. When indigenous peoples challenged the narrative of discovery, they were often accused of denying history rather than reclaiming it. Power protected its own version of events by framing dissent as disruption. Perspective also influenced how success was measured. European expansion was celebrated for wealth gained, territories claimed, and empires built. The cost paid by indigenous societies was rarely included in these calculations. Progress was defined by the advancement of one group at the expense of others. Power allowed this imbalance to be framed as natural development rather than deliberate choice. Over time, the narrative, E of discovery, became self-reinforcing. Laws, borders, and institutions built on that foundation made it harder to question the original premise. If America was discovered, then ownership followed logically. If ownership was legitimate, then displacement became justified. Power ensured that challenging the narrative threatened not just history, but the structures built upon it. Re-examining the role of power and perspective does not erase the past, but it exposes how history was shaped. It reveals that discovery was not an objective truth, but a claim backed by force. It shows that history is not simply what happened, but what was recorded, repeated, and rewarded. Power determined which stories survived and which were silenced. Perspective matters because it shapes identity. Nations define themselves through the stories they tell about their origins. When those stories exclude or distort the experiences of entire peoples, the consequences persist across generations. Power allows these distortions to endure, embedding them in culture, law, and memory. Understanding how power and perspective shaped the discovery narrative opens space for a more honest history. It allows multiple truths to exist without canceling one another. It acknowledges that the same event can be experienced as arrival by one group and invasion by another. Power once decided which interpretation prevailed, but awareness challenges that dominance. The story of discovery is not fixed in the past. It continues to evolve as perspectives once excluded gain recognition. The struggle over historical narrative is itself a reflection of power, revealing whose voices are rising and whose authority is being questioned. History remains a contested space where memory, identity, and justice intersect, shaped by the ongoing effort to confront inherited narratives and redefine understanding in light of perspective. As long ignored. America has never been a finished idea, never a story that reached a clean conclusion and closed its pages. From its earliest human presence to the present moment, it has remained a work in motion, shaped by arrivals and departures, by promises made and promises broken. To say that America is a continuing, unfinished story is to acknowledge that its meaning has never been settled, and that each generation inherits not only the land, but the unresolved questions embedded within it. The earliest inhabitants did not see America as something to be completed. They understood life as cyclical, shaped by seasons, memory, and renewal. Their societies adapted over time, responding to environmental change, internal conflict, and shifting alliances. Change was not a failure of the past, but a natural extension of it. This understanding of continuity would later clash with European ideas of progress, which imagined history as a straight line moving toward dominance, wealth, and control. European arrival introduced new forces that accelerated change and deepened contradiction. Colonization reshaped the land and its people, but it did not create a stable endpoint. Instead, it layered new conflicts onto old ones. Empires rose and fell. Borders shifted. Laws were rewritten. The idea of America expanded and contracted depending on who was speaking and who was excluded. Each attempt to define America revealed its incompleteness, its resistance to a single permanent identity. The founding of new nations did not settle the story. Independence brought ideals of liberty and equality that stood in tension with realities of enslavement, displacement, and inequality. The language of freedom coexisted with systems of exclusion. This contradiction did not resolve itself with time. It became one of the defining features of the American experience. The promise of what America could be continued to inspire, even as the reality of what it was continued to divide. Waves of immigration added new chapters to the story, each group bringing hopes shaped by hardship and imagination. For some, America represented refuge and opportunity. For others, it represented loss, coercion, or survival under pressure. These experiences did not merge into a single narrative, but existed side by side, sometimes intersecting, sometimes clashing. The unfinished nature of America allowed space for reinvention, but also for recurring conflict over belonging and identity. The land itself bears marks of this ongoing story. Cities rise where forests once stood, highways cut through ancestral territories, monuments celebrate certain memories while ignoring others. Each physical change reflects choices made in a particular moment, choices that can be reconsidered or challenged by those who come later. The landscape becomes a record not of completion, but of constant revision. Political struggles further reveal America's unfinished character. Debates over rights, representation, and justice repeat across centuries, reshaped by new context but rooted in unresolved foundations. Expanding democracy has often required confrontation with the limits of earlier definitions. Each expansion exposes exclusions that were once normalized. Progress arrives unevenly, contested and incomplete, reminding the nation that its ideals have always exceeded its practices. Cultural expression reflects this ongoing tension. Literature, music, art, and speech continually reinterpret what America means. Voices once marginalized push into public space, challenging dominant narratives and offering alternative visions. Culture becomes a site of negotiation, where the past is questioned and the future imagined. The absence of a final definition allows creativity to flourish, even as it fuels disagreement. Memory plays a central role in shaping the unfinished story. What is remembered and what is forgotten influence how the present understands itself. Revisiting history unsettles comfortable myths but opens space for deeper understanding. The act of remembering becomes an intervention, reshaping the story rather than simply recounting it. As new generations revisit old events, meanings shift, revealing that history itself is not static. America's unfinished nature also lies in its moral reckoning. Questions of responsibility, repair, and recognition remain open. Injustice does not fade simply because time passes. Its effects persist, demanding response. Each generation must decide whether to ignore inherited harm or confront it. This choice becomes part of the story, influencing how future generations will understand the past. The idea of America continues to evolve beyond borders. Its influence, ideals, and contradictions resonate globally. How it defines itself affects how it is perceived and how it acts in the world. The unfinished story is not confined to one place. It extends through relationships, policies, and cultural exchange. America's internal struggles shape its external presence, reinforcing the sense that its identity remains in flux. Technology and social change accelerate this process. New forms of communication amplify voices and expose contradictions more rapidly. Narratives once controlled by institutions are challenged by individuals and communities. The story becomes more fragmented but also more inclusive. The absence of a single authoritative ending allows for multiplicity, even as it complicates consensus. To call America an unfinished story is not to diminish it, but to describe its true condition. Completion would imply closure, certainty, and final authority. Unfinishedness allows for accountability and possibility. It recognizes that the past still speaks and that the future remains open. Each moment adds to the narrative without resolving it entirely. The question of who America is for, what it stands for, and how it remembers itself remains unsettled. These questions are not flaws, but features of a society shaped by diversity, conflict, and aspiration. The story continues because it must, carried forward by people who inherit its contradictions and decide, consciously or not, how to respond to them, shaping meanings that will themselves be questioned, revised, and reinterpreted as time moves forward and new voices enter the conversation, refusing closure and insisting that America remain a living, evolving idea rather than a completed chapter sealed in the past. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.